Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Schreiner. If it's your first time watching, hello and welcome. We are currently on a journey exploring colored history, and we're getting into the weeds of laws and acts and moving into apartheid quite soon. That's been interesting to read and go through. It's been a journey the last couple of weeks. I'm also preparing a lot of my episodes. I am going to Indonesia to visit my brother-in-law, which I'm super excited about, but making sure there is content for you guys to view. If you haven't yet, please subscribe. And for those who have been subscribed, we've hit 100. I had a lovely walk on the promenade with our dog Luna, and that was the celebration. And then I tweaked my ankle, which is great. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for being here. And let's continue to grow and do this. Today, we'll be solely unpacking the laws that was used to institutionalize segregation. But before that, I really want to close the loop on the last foundations of racial control by looking at the establishment of the Union of South Africa. So what happened? We've kind of spoken about it when I was speaking about the Cape Qualified franchise, because I'm trying to keep this timeline. But this was another significant event on laying those foundations. In 1910, Union combined the 4 colonies into one state. At the South African Act negotiations, because there was negotiations, because they were combining. The Cape's multiracial franchise survived only as the limited protected exception. The other provinces refused non-racial franchise extension. The Union institutionalized a national legislation whose direction largely favored white supremacy. So as we spoke last week, they were really feeling it out with the Glenn Gray Act, and this was just another stepping stone in that direction. So what was the impact? The Union created national institutions that could pass countrywide segregation laws when it came to land, labor, and movement. Movement became a big one, and weakened regional protections. And this was a structural blow to colored political influence beyond the Cape, because obviously they still had the Cape Qualified franchise. So how did the Cape Qualified franchise escape from the South African Act? When talks began in 1808 and 1809 to unify colonies, Afrikaners and English leaders wanted a white man's union. The risk was that the Cape's more liberal franchise would be scrapped. How did they survive this, and how did they manage to make sure that the Cape Qualified franchise wasn't scrapped during this time? They did a lot of political lobbying. We have Abdurrahman, we spoke about last week, and the APO campaigns in Cape Town and London kept coloured rights on the imperial agenda, even if partially successful. The coloured people created alliances. They leaned on liberal whites like John X. Merriman, who was the Prime Minister of the Cape, and William Schreiner, who was the former Prime Minister. They asked them to advocate for them inside the convention. The community highlighted loyalty to Crown and military service, presenting themselves as observing citizens. Even after 1910, coloured leaders focused on schools, civic organizations, and newspapers to keep political consciousness alive, knowing the franchise was under threat. As I spoke about last week, in the Glenn Gray Act, it really was focused on Black South Africans, and where the coloured South Africans were like, well, this is the next step, right? We one step away from it being us. Despite their activism, the South African Act was written it did allow each province to decide its own franchise. And since only the Cape had a multiracial system, it was saved for the Cape alone. So what was the outcome? We spoke, the Cape franchise was retained, but only in the Cape province. It was also carefully worded to ensure that no other province would ever have to adopt it. It was like you choose, and obviously they chose not to. This was a compromise. The new union kept coloured voters in the Cape on the roll, but isolated them politically. William Schreiner became the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. As the Premier, he tried to balance defending the Cape's multi-racial franchise on the one hand and keep political peace on the other. But his refusal to fully back the British aggression made him unpopular with imperial hardliners. When the Anglo-Boer War broke out in 9, Schreiner found himself caught between loyalty to Britain and sympathy for the Afrikaners in the Cape. His government collapsed in 1900, ending his brief premiership. But his lasting contributions came after his premiership. Together with African and colored leaders, Schreiner helped draft petitions and resolutions defending the Cape Qualified franchise, which we spoke about earlier. He lobbied the British Parliament to block the union unless it guaranteed political rights for all races. Very brave. He presented arguments steeped in both moral duty and imperial loyalty. South Africa, he said, would betray Britain's ideals if it created a white man's union. Would it? Okay. But in the end, he was ignored, and the South African Act was passed, entrenching white political control. Delusioned but not defeated, Schreiner turned increasingly to legal advocacy. He represented African and coloreds in cases that tested the limits of segregation laws. He became especially involved in defending Black political leaders, including members of the early African National Congress, the ANC. His courtroom became one of the few spaces where racial injustice was publicly challenged, even if the victories were rare. William Schreiner did not stop the march of segregation, but for coloreds and African leaders, he was a rare ally among the white elites, someone who not only sympathized, but actively worked alongside them at home and abroad. He's willing to stand with the marginalized even when unpopular, earned him respect that outlasted his political career. And in an age where the union was being built on exclusion, William Schreiner offered a different vision, one where law and justice might embrace all South Africans. That a light in the dark of what we're going to cover next. Putting this together and getting to understand what happened. At the end of this, you might feel these poor people, they fought against all of this and they were just not getting anywhere. And it will make you feel a certain way. It definitely did me. When we get to the end of it, yeah, if you need a mo, I understand. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about these acts of control and institutionalizing segregation, which is the making of apartheid, essentially. Before apartheid had a name, it already had a plan written not in speeches or manifestos, but in laws, one after another, shaping where people could live, who they could love, what they could earn, and who they could become. Between 1913 and 1938, South Africa was a country being drawn and divided line by line, law by law. For the colored community, these years were the prelude to erasure, a quiet tightening of the net that would define the next half century. 1913, we had the first war. What was it? The year 1913 marked the birth of modern segregation, the Native Land Act, a cornerstone of what would one day become apartheid. It was deceptively simple. Africans, who made up 80% of the population, were now legally confined to just 7% of the land, later increased to 13%. They were forbidden to own land outside their nature reserves. This was the moment the map of South Africa was rewritten, a map of belonging for few and dispossession for millions. Saul Plaatjes, one of the ANC founders, had these words on the issue of dispossession. Awakening on Friday morning, June the 20th, 1913, the South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. Oh, Sent chills down my spine. Oh, goodness. For the colored community, the Land Act didn't directly dispossess. Many lived in urban areas or coastal settlements, but it did set a terrifying precedent. Land, the anchor of identity and dignity, could be taken away with a stroke of a pen. My stomach just dropped. Mixed race humans in the Northern and Western Cape began to feel pressure. They were free. Geez, I've been doing this a lot. But now fenced in by laws designed to privilege whiteness. The Land Act institutionalized race inequality. It created a permanent underclass of laborers and sharecroppers. It fractured alliances. Colored and African workers who used to work side by side and once shared land. Now the law divided them. Colored people were slowly pushed towards wage labor and away from self-sufficiency. As I spoke about, Plaatje was one of the key figures. He was a journalist and activist who documented the cruelty of this act. We had John Dube, who was the first president of the ANC, who mobilized protests against it. And then, of course, we had Abdurrahman, who warned that the same exclusion would one day target colored voters and property owners. The 13 Act planted the seed for apartheid's racial geography. The Group Areas Act of 1950 was its harvest. Chills. Okay. Then in 1923, we had the Natives Urban Area Act. So this is cities of separation. My heart is breaking going through this. My heart is breaking because these people, this is their land. This is their country. And this was being done to them. Sorry, I'm going to try to get through this without crying. 10 years later came another brick in the wall, the Native Urban Areas Act of 1923. It declared that Africans were temporary visitors in the cities, welcome only to work, never to belong. Municipalities would now create segregated locations, the forerunners of townships. They aimed at Africans. Its logic soon bled into the treatment of coloreds. Mixed-race family who had lived in Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and Kimberley for generations began facing residential zoning and restricted movements. Sorry. The urban segregation became official policy. Cities were white by right and brown and black by permission. Many colored artisans and dock workers lost access to mixed neighborhoods and skilled work. Informal settlements grew in the city edges, which were the early seeds of future areas like Elsie's River and Bonteheuwel. 3 Act legitimized racial zoning, a principle that would later underpin every pass and forced removal law. Then we had 1927, the Immorality Act, which was to police the privacy and intimacy of people. So what was it? By 1927, apartheid's shadow crept into the bedroom. The Immorality Act criminalized sexual relations between white and black South Africans. While it did not yet target colored people explicitly, it cast suspicion over every interracial relationship, especially those with colored women whose very existence symbolized racial mixing in the colonial mind and imagination. The law wasn't about morality. It was about control, as everything is. Control over bloodlines, family, and the idea of racial purity. Where have we heard this? Where are we hearing it today? It embedded the fear of miscegenation into South African identity, turning love into a crime. Colored women were vilified as proof of racial pollution, facing harassment and state scrutiny. Their bodies became battlegrounds for the state's obsession with purity. The act reinforced apartheid's moral foundation. Separation was not just policy, it was ideology. Then the early 1930s brought the illusion of progress. but only for a few. The Women's Enfranchisement Act of 1930 gave white women the right to vote, yet colored and African women remained voiceless. Then in 1936, the Representation of Natives Act stripped Africans in the Cape of the vote altogether. Democracy became selective, racially selective. And once again, Dr. Abdurrahman warned, today them, tomorrow us. These acts cemented white supremacy through the ballot box, ensuring political dominance for generations. Colored voters watched their black allies disenfranchised. Their own rights under the old Cape Qualified franchise began to feel like sand slipping through their fingers. By the late 1930s, racialized politics had become South Africa's default mode, laying the groundwork for the apartheid state to come. The Aliens Act of 1937 declared who would belong and who would not. It tightened immigration, keeping out Jewish refugees from Nazi Europe and anyone deemed undesirable. The message was unmistakable. South Africa was for whites only. A year later, in 1938, Afrikaners celebrated the centenary of the Great Trek, die Groot Trek, with ox wagons, parades, and speeches. The trek was retold as a sacred journey, a myth of divine destiny and white perseverance. For the colored and black majority, these celebrations were salt in the wounds. Their stories were erased from the national narrative, replaced by a tale of conquest and chosen people. 1938 ignited the flame of Afrikaner nationalism, a movement that would seize power in 1948 and formalize apartheid. They became invisible in their own land, coloreds and black South Africans, excluded from citizenship, ignored in history, and trapped in a legal web that defined them by what they were not. The mythology of 1938 became the ideology of apartheid, a vision of nationhood built on separation, sanctified by history. So, on closer reflection, if we look at this in order, this is the way it went. By 1938, the map of South Africa was already divided, not yet by bulldozers or police lines, but by law and language. The Native Land Act took the land. The Urban Areas Act took the cities. The Immorality Act took intimacy. The Representations Act took the vote. And the Great Trek Centenary took the story of the nation itself. For the colored community, these decades forged both marginalization and resilience. They were excluded, yet they endured, forming schools, unions, and political movements that would one day challenge the empire of apartheid. These were the shadows before the storm, the quiet decades when control became culture and separation became law. It's really heartbreaking to read this, understand how people were stripped of things one piece at a time, and it, it breaks my heart. And we'll talk. Sorry, just give me a minute. It. I feel like it must have felt impossible at this stage to be able to reclaim what was once yours. And as we go deeper into this, it might feel that, but you have to see the flower that grows even in concrete. That's the image I have in my head. Through this, there were so many people fighting the good fight. There were so many people going up against this. They kept message out there. And I keep saying it's going to get worse before it gets better, but it does. So join me next week. I'll be talking about 4 wonderful women and just bring you bits of their story and how they tried to fight these laws that were being brought into effect. And then after that, we'll get into the hardcore laws and get really into the building, the final parts that entrenched us into apartheid. So thank you. This was a hard one for me. I hope you come back and hear the proses of next week. Thanks so much for watching. And I'll see you next week. Bye.